Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast you don't want to miss. You're about to get a sneak peek at what goes on behind the scenes with authors. We'll find out their secret recipe for creating a book. We'll tell you where they get their ideas, and you will get the inside scoop on their newest project. Want to know more? We'll tell you where to find them on social media. Are you ready? Okay, let's meet today's author. Joining me is Dan Hare, and he's here to talk about the Possession series. It's a 2-book series. The first book is called The Gloaming, and the second book is called A Dawning. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be talking to you today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. These 2 books are so creative. They're fantasy fiction, and I'm so curious about how you came to write fantasy fiction. When did you start writing?
So I always had the idea that I had a good story to tell, and I suppose I reached a point in my life where I felt I'd lived enough to have the kind of experiences to draw on that I wanted to explore in my writing. But I was always a fan of fantasy fiction growing up. The first book I remember reading really was The Hobbit. I can remember being off school sick, really kind of milking it for all it was worth so I could get an extra day of reading The Hobbit and not having to go back to school. So the opportunity presented itself for me to actually find the time and sit down and write. And so I took that opportunity and didn't look back really.
You've created, similar to what Tolkien did, you have created a world all your own that has action and intrigue and mystery and magic. Where did this come from? Did you just jump out of your head? Where did this come from?
So I suppose it's the influences of the worlds I'd been reading about. Like I say, when I was a kid, I loved to get lost in Middle Earth and places like that in other series, and I suppose I wanted to create a world that I could mould myself and fill full of characters to empathise with and convey the themes I wanted to explore through the story I was writing. I think books like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit sort of gave me the starting point of creating a world. But what I did find was once I started writing, that world grew to an extent by itself. I can remember writing passages where I didn't feel my hand could keep up with the thoughts going through my head, and at the end of those passages just thinking, wow, I didn't see that happening. So it kind of grew organically, I suppose.
Do you see the action as you write? I've talked to many fiction writers, and I've written a little fiction myself, and when you talk about the writing process, I think perhaps non-fiction writers think it sounds a little bit nuts, if you'll pardon the expression. But I know when I sat down, I would see it was like a film started in my head, yeah. And I would simply do exactly what you described. I would try to record the action as I saw it happening in my head. Is that the way your process works as well?
Yeah, I believe so. So I think I saw all the events of the book from the point of view of the main protagonist, Can. And so in the action sequences, it was like I was watching a movie. So I had to keep a track of, okay, so if he's moved a certain way to engage this character, and these people have moved around behind him to attack in from that direction, I needed to kind of map that out on a piece of paper as well. So I was drawing sort of maps of the scenes I had in my head, and with little counters of where the characters would be stood and where they'd moved. But it's essentially I had to visualize it, which just came as I was writing. I visualized how the people were moving and how the action played out.
Did the characters wake you up in the middle of the night?
Yeah, so in the middle of the night, and and on long journeys. So I wrote this. I finally sat down to write this book when I was working away, and it was a 2-hour commute on a motorway mainly. And I'd be driving along the motorway, and a piece of dialogue would pop into my head, or the resolution of how I wanted a scene to end. And like, crikey, I'm driving, I can't stop and write this down. So, I ended up using my phone as a dictaphone, and just talking incessantly to my phone on journeys, desperate to capture everything that was in my head before I kind of lost it. But yeah, there were a few moments in the night where I woke up and thought, I know I've got to write this down. I will forget, and it won't be there in the morning.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing how the creative process works.
Yeah, and as I say, I was amazed. I never believed it myself before, but I was amazed at how the story kind of took over and told itself. And yeah, there were parts where I thought, okay, well, that's a lot better than I thought. That's a much nicer direction than the direction I was going to take it. Yeah, that just makes far more sense. And it kind of written itself.
The characters literally will take over the creative process, and they won't do a wrong thing. And you're right. They will see something you don't. It's the strangest creative process is the only way I can describe it, but it's the craziest thing that happens because they do write the story for you. We all know that it's your brain. We all know that it's your imagination, and yet there's something almost magical that happens with that creative process. So let's give the listeners an overview of the two books. Now, this is a complicated book, not unlike any of the Tolkien books. There are lots of characters, there's lots of action. So let's give them sort of a general overview of who the characters are and a little bit about what's happening.
Okay, sure. So I think to give the overview, I have to just briefly say what I intended, what the intention behind the story was, and that was I wanted to explore the underlying theme of anxiety around the human condition, if you like, and that's kind of what I needed for that was to have something like an invasion, which was inevitable and affects everyone, and there's no stopping it, and that it can come at any time. So that was sort of the fundamental threat to run throughout the book, and so understanding that, we can look through the eyes of the main protagonist, who's who's been tasked to wait and watch and keep a vigil of the invasion by his mentor, who's the King's champion, Braster. Now, what Braster does is warns him of this threat and then shuffles off scene. He disappears. He goes off being the King's champion and leaves Kandorl to sit alone and obsess and watch for signs of this invasion. And what compounds Can's misery is no one else around will acknowledge the inevitable truth of the invasion coming. So he's kind of lonely and tortured, and when the lord of the village is murdered, chaos ensues, and that kind of gives him a now or never moment to vigil and go and find Braster. He's seeking Braster's help to in trying to overcome the threat of this invasion and how to prepare for it, and also how this fear, this obsession has manifested for him into these creatures which torment him and try and claim him. So Can decides to leave to find Braster, and he talks his companions into joining him, and they're kind of bemused because they don't really understand why he's so obsessed. But they decide to join him, and the land they travel through is a brutal land which has been torn apart by different groups of fighters as they fight over what's available before the invasion does come. And so it's the traumas and the predicaments these characters find themselves in and how they adapt to overcome, which I think we can watch on in interest, and sometimes we applaud them and cheer them on for how they react, and in other times we stand back aghast, looking on in horror at what they're turning into. So it's the search for Braster and the search for answers, and the journey, literally and figuratively, of each and every one of those characters.
And you've got so much action. I mean, there is action. There's magic. There are scenes. I mean, Braster is quite a character himself. He has a magical power about him. It's very interesting. I read parts of both of the books, and the story continues. It starts out in the gloaming, and then it continues in a dawning. So the story flows beautifully.
Yeah.
Is there a part that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yes, if I may. That would be really good. So perhaps I should set the scene before I read the passage. So the companions have taken respite at Lord Petran's tower, and their hopes that Braster had remained there had been dashed the night before. So they're woken to the sound of one of the companions ruled screaming in the clearing below the tower, and Can joins Theko in trying to rescue their friend, and he's trying to rescue him from this famous group of fighters known as the Revenants. Can has warned Sienna and Medral to remain out of sight below the parapet at the top of the tower, but he's actually oblivious to the fact that they're at work trying to save him from his own demons. So that's where this passage begins. So one of the archers suddenly pointed up towards the tower. Both men unslung their bows from their backs and began to notch arrows. They'd seen Sienna and Medral now laughed as they chanted, planning to take practice shots at the women. Kandorl felt the strength returning to his hands, and he gripped his sword as if he meant to bend the metal. They were going to have to get past the man and the woman screaming brack and close down the archers. The tower was in range of even their short bows. Why had Sienna and Medral not stayed hidden, he thought, his anger rising, further replenishing his strength. Rans, how take them, Brack said, pointing towards him and Theko. Brack, Brack, Brack. Brack's voice boomed over the din, punishing Kandorl's ears. Even Thecco grimaced, looking as if he might empty his stomach. Kandorl was distracted from the archers lining up their shots as the two axemen advanced, screaming their leader's name as they did so, and pulling their long-handled axes from their belts as they moved. Thecco turned to face them both, his knees bending slightly as he assumed the fool's guard perfectly, the laziness of the hold, belying the concentration and focus required by the fighter, willing to use it to invite his foes on. There was a moment where Kandorl thought he heard nothing at all, where everything stood still and was silent. Mine, the terrible, familiar voice roared through Kandorl's head, and he choked back a scream. Below, the black earth churned as Kandorl looked to the sky above, fearing it had finally fallen in between the battlefield world into murderous action.
Of course, I don't want you to stop, but that's a perfect choice. That leaves us on the very edge of what happens next. So let's tell our listeners, Dan, where they can find the book. Now, I always go to Amazon. That's most people's choice for purchasing books in this day and time. And if our listeners will go to the Amazon website, at the very, very top, there is a search feature. And if they'll just put in the title of the book, they can put in The Gloaming, or they can put in A Dawning, or they can put in the title A Possession.
Yeah.
The Possession series. And by Dan, D-A-N, Hare, H-A-R-E. And then just click. And it comes up beautifully. And the covers are really very, very beautiful on these books. It shows a double book, and then it shows each book separately. And if the listener will click on the separate books, it will come up in a larger size. And up in the upper right-hand corner of the cover, it says read here or open here. If they'll click on that, there is a really, really fine excerpt from each one of the books that they can read so that they get a flavor and a feel. Your prose is beautiful, and they can get a feel and a flavor for your prose and for the action. Amazon is the major source for the sale of the books. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, absolutely as you describe, yeah.
Now, if they want to find you, where can they find you, Daniel?
Okay, so two ways of finding me. One's on Facebook. I have a page that's entitled The Author of the Procession. And secondly, I have my own website, which is daniel-hare.com.
What will they find on the website, Dan?
Okay, so there's a bit about me and a large, quite unflattering picture of me there. There's a blog, a place to leave comments, questions, and then there's a link to the books on Amazon that, just click the link and it will take you to the Amazon page you've just described.
I always like to leave you as the author with the opportunity to have the last word with the listeners. Did you write the book simply to entertain the listener so that when they read the book and they metaphorically close the book for the last time, they say to themselves, this was a rollicking good time, this was a great adventure, it was a wonderful story? Or is there something deeper? Is there something more that you would like the reader to take away?
I think so, and I think identifying that it is part of what gives you the passion to write. It's something close to your heart you want to share that really drives you forward in wanting to complete the project and share it with your readers. So I personally wanted to write about a world based on my perception of the real one, because especially in these times, the real world can seem dark and our future's kind of bleak. So I wanted to share how, for me, it was possible to change that perception. And so to do so, I needed to create a fantasy world. I suppose I could mould in a group of characters real enough to relate to and empathise with. And that's what I hope I've achieved.
I think you have. I think you have done such a beautiful job with a very complex, complicated story. I love the characters. I love the action. I love what you've done with the story. And I want to thank you so much for being our guest today on Books on Air.
Thank you as well. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for giving me your time. It's been great.
Remember, you can find the Possession series by Dan Hare on Amazon. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. By the way, you can also hear this podcast on iTunes as well as iHeartRadio. I'm Suzanne Harris. I hope you'll join our next Books on Air podcast, and remember, it's really the place to be. Thank you so much for listening.